Thanks a lot for the invitation to this lecture series and for the introduction by Thomas. I didn't have a clue who is the audience, and maybe you don't have a clue what I will talk about, and I hope we get somehow together. So initially for this talk, my colleague from Cologne, Eleftheria Paliou, professor for archaeoinformatics, and I were asked if the indigenous communities in Namibia, with whom both of us have worked, had a concept of sustainability. Both of us did not know, but I doubt that there's a concept of sustainability in the communities we are working with. For curiosity, I checked the dictionary for Kwekwegoa, which is a dialect continuum, which also covers the language spoken by Haiːom, about whom I will talk, but I could not find an entry for it. I also asked two colleagues who can speak Kwekwegoa fluently, and they were not aware of such a word either, but they suspected that the Kwekwe language committee, there's a committee for this language continuum, might have recently invented or will invent such a word in Kwekwe in future, because it's all over. Also, there is no word for it, and the concept as such was not familiar to the Haiːom, that some strategies which could be called sustainable strategies or of resource management in a Western sense. Yet I do think it is more than some strategies. These are embedded in what I call their ontoepistemology, their way of knowing and being. And I think this ontoepistemology is worth looking at in the context of sustainability. I start with a quotation from Daniel R. Wildcat, who is coming from another continent, a professor at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, and an indigenous scholar who writes on indigenous knowledge, technology, environment, and education. Can you imagine, do I get this out? Can you imagine a world where nature is understood as full of relatives, not resources, where inalienable rights are balanced with inalienable responsibilities, and where wealth itself is measured not by resource ownership and control, but by the number of good relationships we maintain in the complex and diverse life systems of this blue-green planet? I can. This might direct your view to what I'm going to talk about. I present a case study from Haiːom, who were formerly living in the Etosha National Park in Namibia. Briefly, I introduce the area and the people before I contextualize my own knowledge a bit. Afterwards, I describe my understanding of Haiːom being in Etosha and their way to relate to their environment. Finally, I reflect on the question what to say about sustainability and what could be learned from them in the context of nature conservation and beyond. The Etosha National Park is situated around the huge Etosha salt pan and has its name from it. It is Namibia's greatest wildlife sanctuary with more than 22,000 square kilometers and one of the world's largest national parks. It is a premier tourist attraction in Namibia. I guess many of you have already heard about it, and was created as Game Reserve number 2 in 1907 by the German colonial government. It was for a long time also during the South African period a game reserve, and part of this game reserve, which was stretching until the west coast, was proclaimed as national park in '67. As the first national park in 1967. It is promoted as Africa's wilderness and is known for all the wildlife which is living there. But Etosha was the home of Haiːom for many centuries. The Haiːom are a San group, formerly called Bushmen, in Namibia, who mostly lived from hunting and gathering in the past. They lived in northern central Namibia in pre-colonial and early colonial times in and around what later became the Etosha National Park. Here's a map which we compiled for my PhD. I tried to find out which authors in early colonial times have talked about or have mentioned Haiːom in terms of space, and you see different kinds of pronunciation of spellings and different areas, but more or less all, yeah, some put them up to Windhoek, Haiļom written here by Bleek, others put them just close to the Etosha pan as Haiļom, Bushleute. So it wasn't clear exactly where they were living, but somewhere in northern central Namibia. And in the beginning of the game reserve from 1907 up to the 40s, the Haiļom were still allowed to stay in the game reserve at their traditional places, which were waterholes or close to waterholes, permanent waterholes, southeast of the pan. This area close to, yeah, it's too small, but that area is mostly Haiļom area, so to say. The western part was much too dry for people to permanently staying there. Until the 1940s, Haiļom were regarded as part and parcel of the game reserve, as, for example, the native commissioner of Ovamboland had mentioned in official documents. Until the 1940s, the Haiļom were regarded as part and parcel, but this changed due to changing ideas about nature conservation. First of all, the idea that the fortress conservation model entered Namibia as well via South Africa, and the Kruger National Park was taken as shiny example for tourist development as well, and it was there were too many tourists, and the South African administration had to find new places where they could direct tourists. And during that time, the idea that nature and culture had to be separated in order to conserve nature and to become national parks became prominent. Another reason why they were evicted in 1954 was that the farmers in the vicinity needed farm laborers, and as long as they could stay at the traditional places, they could still hunt and gather and didn't need to become laborers. So they were evicted, and most of the Haiļom from the Etosha area were evicted and had to become farm laborers. Only a few found employment at the police stations, which later became national rest camps for tourists in the park. And most of here you see a map from 1983 when Marais, a person, needed to do a survey for the administration, and you see that the black spots are where Haiļom were recorded to live, and all of that are commercial farms outside of Etosha. And then there were a couple of employees still at the 3 rest camps in Etosha. After independence, many moved as well to the townships and towns, and recently some resettlement farms have been bought for the Haiļom. Just to situate my own knowledge, where do I come from? How did I get to know what I know? I worked with the Haiļom in Etosha linked to my PhD, roughly speaking, between 2000 and 2007, and later on still when I was working in Namibia. During that time, I got involved and later coordinated a cultural heritage and mapping project with the Haiļom in Etosha, where we tried to document their knowledge of the park in order to use it in a way for tourism, that the image of Etosha got extended, that not just wildlife was known as what Etosha presents, but also the cultural heritage of the people who formerly have lived there and their human history in the past. That was the idea of the cultural heritage and mapping project. And in that project, in connection to that, the archaeologists from Cologne also joined for several, and archaeozoologists also joined for several field trips to Etosha. Then I changed my kind of career, and not really, because I continued working with SAN and Haiļom in Namibia, but I worked for the Legal Assistance Center and NGO in Namibia and did rather applied research with Haiːom, San, and other marginalized communities, and was research coordinator at this Namibian NGO. Then, for private reasons, I returned back to Germany and did further research in the region and on indigenous people in Namibia, and also critically assessed my former research inspired by the ontological turn, the science and technology studies, for example, post-colonial studies, environmental humanities, and by persons like Ingold, Bert David, Barra, Blazer, Burman, Law, and Moll Nedesty. Some of them, not all, are anthropologists. And then in 2023, I participated in a field trip of the archaeoinformatics project of Eleftheria Paliu, where Andreas was also with us in October, to work with another San group who's living in the eastern part of Namibia. I use one specific place, a water hole, to illustrate the way we worked and how knowledge was produced there. This is called, in the Haiːom language, they call it Bikap. Officially, it's called Ombika water hole. It's close to the southern gate of Etosha. And this is maybe how tourists might come to see it. You see a very dry landscape, depending on season. In the back, you see a couple of animals far away. You can't even see really the water at this place. Sometimes tourists might see more animals, sometimes they don't see any at all. But when you visit these kind of places, or especially Ombika, then you learn much more on these places. The people with whom you go, they talk about the animals, they talk about how they hunted them. They show you, if you're allowed to go out of the car, meaning if you have a game ranger with you, they show you where the hunting shelters were at the specific water holes. They explain the different methods, how to hunt, and that for which animals they use poison arrows, for example, and which were the different ways. They didn't just hunt at water holes, but also in groups. It depended on the different animals as well. Then they talked about which meat was good meat, how they slaughtered, etc. They also talked about the settlements at the water holes. Here's Tiki Mobosep, who during that time already lived she lived in a township, in a town 100 kilometers away from Etosha, in a zinc hut, but she was born in Etosha. And she showed us the remains of the huts which were there. She could even point to the hut, the remains where she had been born. We found there no, you can't, an old bully beef lit. You can maybe read Rindfleisch on top, and the people explained to us that they got, during a certain period, and just before the eviction, they got rations from the colonial administration, so they got food in order to, in the official language, to befriend the Bushmen. In the language of a Haiːom, they said, "Let ons saamgemaak" in Afrikaans. In English, they tamed us before they evicted us. So those things we found in this wonderful wilderness place of Etosha. And the people also talked about bush food, which kind of bush food to find in which area, during which season it would be harvested, which bush food could be stored. We have a list, I don't know, from 100 different plants, and how they used it and when you could collect them and what else could be done, what was medicine, etc. They also talked about specific personalities. First, they had lots of stories about Haiːom people. They always referred to surname, which made me in the end find doing family trees, which I never wanted to do, like traditional anthropological stuff. I wasn't interested, but in order to understand how people relate to each other, because it was so important, I started with family tree maker and made family trees with, in the end, had more than 1,000 individuals. because they refer to these people and often also with surnames. But it was, for me, it was important to understand these organizational issues. But Peter Stark was not a blood relative of them who's there. He was a personality, he was a game ranger in Etosha. First he was a poacher in Etosha, but later he became game ranger because the Nature Conservation Department thought that it's better to employ him than to let him hunt poachers instead of being a poacher. So that's how he got employed in Etosha, but he was very respected by the Haióm because he could speak the Haióm language. He called himself the White Bushman. And they said he could walk, They were really respectful for him, but he also had sympathy with them and brought them, for example, to specific areas after the eviction where they could collect bush food during the time of the year when it was ripe. One of the main members of our team with whom we worked, Willem Dauchap, he also talked about the water snake living at Ombika, which died because it was killed, and after it was killed, the water dried up. At other places, people showed us as well graves or talked about spirit beings riding elephants, devastating the whole area, or the people, threatening the people. But what I want, so as you can see, maybe my own perspective on the landscape of the Etosha National Park changed considerably over the period of my fieldwork. Upon my arrival, my perception was certainly not very different from common Western views of African landscapes in general and Etosha in particular. I saw an arid environment populated with an abundance of wild animals in an essentially bare and rather monotonous landscape, epitomized by the Etosha Pan, the huge salt pan. Driving through Etosha at first, it was hard to imagine how people survived in this landscape, which did not appear to be very hospitable. With the ongoing work and journeys with Etosha, with Haióm, who remembered having lived there, my own perspective on the park changed considerably, and the hostile turned into a more familiar and habitable environment. Even for me, Etosha became a historical and entangled landscape of human and beyond the human beings. However, during that time, I was still deeply impaired by a rather Cartesian ontology, anthropocentric and anthropohybristic, embedded in categorical thinking about objects, considering plant and animal species as resources to be exploited by humans. I was not yet equipped with concepts of relational epistemologies or ontologies, and lacked a fine grasp of beings beyond the human and animism. As mentioned, my current thinking is influenced by works of Tim Ingold, Deborah Bird-Rose, Nurtbert David, working in different parts of the world, and by many others who have published on specific cases of hunter-gatherer ecologies, ontologies, and animism. By Karen Barra, who is a feminist physician, and is also influenced by, as I said, ontological turn and new animism. I will now go a bit more into detail in describing the relations of Haióm to land people, to beyond the human beings, namely, in this case, animals and spirit beings. People cum land, I borrow this terminology from Whitlock, who worked with Haióm further east in Namibia. And while I'm in this talk mostly focusing on a rather micro scale, there were different levels as well of people cum land connections, so to say. There were clusters of people who belong to different regions, so to say, but I'm focusing mostly on the micro level here. On the picture, you might wonder, what is that? That was a water owl called Nugubes. It was on old colonial maps, but then disappeared from the maps because it's not accessible anymore via a road. And while we were working with the Haiːom, we found that water hole, what has been the water hole, because it was a very important place for the people in former times. And this man, he's Haiːom, and he was from that area. He grew up in that area because his mother's father was the headman of that area. And here he's doing the welcoming ritual, like putting in former times ash on the legs of others, of the incomers, to welcome them to the place. And only then they would be allowed to drink water there or to be there, basically. The first thing was that they had to be welcomed by the headman in putting something from the ground on their legs. People and places were connected to each other, and personal identities belonged to the land. Specific family groups were linked to specific areas. These family groups were headed by family elders who, as with many other hunter-gatherer groups, had to be respected elders, mostly men, sometimes women, who could listen to the people, could mediate in the case of conflicts, and were the ones in overseeing the sustainable use of resources in a Western way of thinking. For instance, they decided when and in which direction to hunt, or when the bush food was to be harvested and where. They could also punish someone entering the area without asking permission, or someone who recklessly broke branches from bush food shrubs. Maybe it's worth mentioning that, Haiːom, as other hunter-gatherers, were mostly organized egalitarian, so the level of hierarchy was very low. In my words, these kind of headmen were the ones who had the responsibility to care towards the people, the land, and other elements of the ecology. Maybe one could also call them stewards of the land, as someone has done, an anthropologist for another Khoisan group in Namibia. These men or women could also be replaced if it turned out that they were not fulfilling their duties. So it was not this kind of strictly heritage kind of position as in many other societies. Usually a grandson or nephew was chosen by the Gaikwep, the headman, because of his personal qualities. He was taught by him and would take over the role later in his life. For example, furthermore, the system was nested. For example, while due to his personal qualities, a certain man might have been considered the headman of a bigger area comprising several settlements and permanent waterholes, each settlement might have had a senior respected person as well. At times, the headman of the bigger area would assign a certain place to another man, for example, his nephew. Here you see two hills. They are very prominent in Etosha because Etosha doesn't have a lot of hills, and you can see them from far, and at least you are seeing something when driving through Etosha. They are called officially Dolomite Hills. For the Haiːom, they have the name Haiːom and Muaisep, because Muaisep was the headman. I mentioned him in the context of the ritual on the slide before. He was the headman of a larger area, and he decided both to give the smaller hill to his nephew Haiːom. Both areas had a lot of bush food, it was said. So that's why these hills have the name of the personalities who at once were responsible for these hills. At times, Haiːom core team members also had to discuss who was the headman of specific areas. Sometimes the information of various interviewers were inconsistent. Furthermore, the headman list, which a farmer also engaged in research on Haiːom, Reinhard Friedrich, compiled, shows differences to our own list of headmen. We also tried, we have a data set with all the information on the different waterholes and who was headman there. Sometimes they had to discuss who was there, and as I mentioned, it differed from what another guy came up with. This is a further indication that headmanship was a flexible institution, the important criteria being age and respect, and that the elder belonged to the place, meaning that he was part of the family group connected to that specific patch of land, and that he knew that place very well. The boundaries of specific areas were at times reportedly marked with beacons, for example, rocks put in trees. For us, it was difficult to understand. They always mentioned these borders, but there's nothing visible for us. They were well known to the Haiːom in and around that specific area, and specific rules were reported to be in place in case that someone engaged the territory and entered the territory of another group. In case I argue that the existence of these outlined areas is not a proof of ownership in a Western sense, as a very specific subject-object relation, implying entitlements such as use, control, and sale. It is rather an indication that family groups were tied to specific patches of land and had guardianship over the area, that places and people belong to each other. Apart from the living elders, also ancestors cared and looked after the land and human behavior towards it. Putting these boundaries of these areas on a map, as Friedrich has done, can be understood as an acknowledgement of the fact that people were spatially organized. However, it is also misleading because it implies, at least to a Western audience, an idea of separate people and land entities which fixed boundaries, like people strictly belong to that area, and were strictly just staying at this area. In contrast, kinship networks played a major role in terms of land-people organization, and the social and the organization of mobility crisscrossed these boundaries. Haiːom, as I mentioned at BCAP, had an extensive kinship knowledge, not so much in depth, meaning across generations reaching back several centuries, but in width, let's say from the grandparents downwards to all the people who are coming out. Moving from one place to another entailed the enactment and mobilization of family relations. For example, I mentioned Kadison, here's Nububes, that was his area, but where he was staying with his mother and father, but his father's father was from Obaub area, so he could activate these family ties and move there for a while as well, or the whole small family. Or Wilhelm came from Sinap, another person with whom we worked. He was born there, but he had ties. He was staying there with his mother and stepfather, but he had ties to this area, Homop and Aus. And at times they moved to that area as well. He also had ties to this area where his stepfather came from. So people, the kinship ties were very important because it allowed mobility over, and for people, I think it's ingrained in their heads, and ingrained in a way in the landscape. They knew which place belonged to whom and how you relate to this specific person. Specific rules were reported to be in place in case someone entered the territory of another group, in case specific kinship ties did not ensure immediate access. These rules, their application and sanctions might have varied, but for example, a man who wanted to hunt in another headman's area needed to ask permission from this headman. It was also said that a hunter killing in another area had to leave a piece of meat or the poisoned arrowhead with that family elder. The same applied to the collection of bush food. What is important here is that a social organization was in place, which, in a Western way of thinking, ensured institutionalized resource management. People didn't just move around shooting wherever and whenever they felt like or had a chance. People and beings beyond the human is the most difficult thing to grasp for me, and I do think other people who belong rather to my cultural background. Systematic studies on Haiďom ontologies and Haiďom's relations to beings beyond the human are still outstanding. Lowe, who mainly worked on Khoisan healing, and Günther, who worked on sound cosmologies, mention Haiďom occasionally. Hints are also found in Thomas Whitlock's, I mentioned him, publications. Evidently, Haiďom ontology shares some features with the ontologies of other Khoisan in the region. Khoisan are all the click languages in Southern Africa and Hadza in East Africa. During my fieldwork for my PhD and the mapping project, my focus was another one. And as I said, I wasn't equipped with understanding things like that. And I was looking for resources in a way, and how to use resources by humans who were controlling them, or at least using them and exploiting them. So I cannot provide a systematic overview either. But I will provide some snapshots and fragments in this regard, which illustrate the particularity of Western ontology, and that Haiďom ontologies crisscross Western conceptualizations. Clear is they were animistic in the sense that animals could be regarded as beings or persons or selves, and that the world is inhabited by spirit beings, or was inhabited by spirit beings. I provide some few examples on this. Lions were considered as colleagues and equals. The Haiďom team members reported that Haiďom usually, but of course they were also dangerous. But they reported that Haiďom usually chased lions away with a piece of burning wood. Still, when a lion was approaching and no fire was around, they would shout at the lion, which they translated to us as, "You ugly face, go away." Apparently, this did not always work, and there were many stories as well about Haiďom lion encounters, often but not always with a happy end for the Haiďom, that they managed to escape. But these stories also, for me, they talk about an encounter which is on an equal basis. You are fighting with a lion as you are fighting another man. It's not like, I mean, we are shooting lions and they need to be very far away. It was more like a direct contact, and sometimes they win, sometimes I win. But we are the same kind, that kind of, and yeah, because both of them were hunters, so to say. Lion meat was usually not eaten at all. Only one family with the surname Oresep had the reputation of consuming lion meat, the bad reputation, I have to say. One story recounts a man exactly with that surname who had once killed a lion, prepared the meat, and ate some at the settlement next to the water, or Umubes. So he killed and he ate the lion. What remained of the lion had to be buried, and all the people in the settlement were called to attend the burial and were roaring like lions. Evidently, the killed lion was treated like a fellow, and Haiďom performed a kind of mimicry, behaving like lions. Also, the later death of this lion eater, Oresep, was interpreted as being a direct consequence of him having eaten lion meat. Note, it's worth mentioning as well that one of the spirit beings or sources of spiritual power of the Haiďom is a Haiďom, a lion spirit, which can pass his spirit on to specific people who can become later healer shaman, as I call them, because they have this kind of, healer or shaman position. In Haiďom, they are called Rayop if they're men, and Rayos if they are female. The Haiďom team members explained the process when the lion gets the lion spirit gets the specific man as in the following way. The lion spirit starts to, now he falls in love with a specific person. They are playing around in the bush. The lion becomes a mate, and the man caught by the spirit of a lion, disappears several evenings in the bush. He's not coming back. He needs treatment then from another Gayop, shaman or healer, otherwise he would disappear forever with the lions. When treated, he might turn into a healer shaman himself. It was also said that the lion healer received lion hair while getting the spirit from the lion hair from the lion spirit. With regard to prey animals, specific rules were in place, pointing to the fact that wildlife was not recklessly exploited. There was variation as to which species and which individuals were hunted during which season. There were further food taboos as to which species, individuals, or parts of individual animals were allowed to be consumed at all, or by whom. And the meat of a butchered animal had to be shared according to complex rules. First, specific parts were eaten at the place where it died, like the liver. Other things were transported back to the settlement, and there was a central, I call it kitchen, there was a central tree where the hunters were cutting, sharing, and preparing the meat. And the woman got the meat from the man at the specific, at the house, at that kitchen place of the man, cooking place of the man, and they took it back to their individual huts and prepared it there. Furthermore, meat hunting did not place every day. First, and they stressed that several times, first everything had to be eaten, including the skin. I can't imagine that, but they said so, of an animal. Everything had to be finished before the headman then decided, in their words, oh, we are hungry now, that is time to go hunting again. And when men went out for hunting, they let each other know. So several men went to several directions, or several group of men. They let each other know in case they had shot something. They used springbok horn to, it was kind of their telephone, they explained to me. They could, they made specific sounds to let others know specific messages. And if they had shot something, and which could be tracked then the same day or the next day, they let other people know, then the man would rather engage all together in the tracking and slaughtering of the animal rather than in further hunting. Prey animals were not regarded as mere resources. A specific ritual had to be carried out when hunting large game. When the hunters found the killed animal, normally it was shot, and it took several hours or mostly days, I think, for the poison to work. And they knew beforehand if they saw the arrow shaft, they knew, make a guess how long it would take when they regarded, or when they checked also the blood, and they knew when to start tracking and where, of course. When the hunter found the killed animal, the hunter had to incise into the animal's auricles at the base so that the external ears could be folded downwards to cover its eyes. Then the blood vessel beneath the eye would be slit to let out some blood, and the upper tip of the bow was dipped into the blood and the vertical line drawn on the hunter's forehead. Then the lower tip of the bow had to be dipped into the blood as well, which was used to draw a horizontal line across the chest and a vertical line on each of the lower legs. I have to say, I haven't been too interested in these kind of rituals, but as I work with the archaeozoologists who work through each and every different animal with me with a questionnaire, and we ask them all the questions: how to hunt, how to use, where did it occur, what do you know about that? That's how we came up with this exact description of this kind of ritual. But later I was also happy to have it because it gives you stuff to think about again. And I do nowadays think that this ritual could also be seen in the context of animist meat-eating dilemmas, that people who see animals as being, who regard animals as being, if they would eat that meat, it would be cannibalism. So they need to do something to avoid or at least decrease the burden, so to say. And for me, this ritual could be understood as an attempt to make the act of slaughtering and eating less cruel for the animal by preventing it from seeing or from seeing each other. Because, yeah, with seeing, with that relation, you become a being, and a being can't be killed that way. Be it as it may, this ritual points out that prey animals were not perceived as objects to be used and consumed, but as have been treated with respect. Snakes, their meanings for and relations to humans would deserve further exploration too. I didn't collect enough material to be able to analyze their significance in the Haiːom environment. Some were just dangerous black mambas, but others had, there's more meaning to snakes. Excuse me. But snakes were mentioned in various contexts and at various places all over again. It was reported that every big water had a water snake, and when the snake was killed, as was in the case of Bikap, which I showed on one of the first slides, the water dried up. But being alive, the snake would not trouble the people, and the people could continue living there. Furthermore, some stories related to snakes big as roads, which I think I call them mythical snakes, and those kind of things are also, snakes are also documented for other Khoisan groups, great snakes, as well as water snakes, and there are specific meaning for people. Furthermore, according to our team members, snake spirits were among this different Namagu, the different spirit beings, which populate the world of the Haiːom and who can transfer their potency or spirit to healers and shamans. Okay, spirit beings are, of course, the most difficult thing to grasp, or not, of course, but they are, for me, they are at least. Here you can just see Kadis and Kumup, who is the son of a healer, who was the son of a healer, Elias, who was a powerful leader, he said, or powerful healer shaman, not leader, or spiritual leader in a way. And here he showed us the outfit of his father, who was a leader, was still at his sister's place. And at one stage, people were doing a movie on it. He showed that, and he showed us the outfit which he had to wear when doing trance or healing dances. And you can see here specific things. And as far as I understood, these things, the healers get specific things from the spirit beings, and these things are all put there and make them very powerful. I certainly simplify because I don't understand all of that. But what for me is the most interesting thing and the most difficult to grasp is that a spirit being is giving something material to the people themselves. Like the rain spirit was giving with a thunder, or no, with the lightning, it was giving, how do you call it, Muscheln, cochlea to the people. And they have these cochlea, and in former times I tried to make sense out of it. And I couldn't, of course, because in our world, we can't, either it is there or it is not there, but there's no spirit being who is giving me some Muscheln or some lion hair. Anyway, I don't have other photos of spirit beings, of course. That's why I put Kadison where he showed us all these things there. But spirit beings were an integral part of the ecology. The information about spirit beings vary from person to person, but what I got to understand is that spirit beings were ambivalent. They could do good and could also do harm. The most potent spirit being was the spirit of the rain, Manus. Furthermore, as mentioned, there was a spirit of the lion, the spirit of snakes, and the spirit of Kaindaus. Kaindaus was also called Sochachus, which means taboo thing. She was described to me as a malicious female animal human mixture who would fall in love with and rape a man. And that's how he could also get the spirit. And so all these spirit beings could give their spirit to specific people, first in falling in love with them or something like that. And then these people had to go to healers themselves in order to become shamans or healers. So yeah, each spirit being, I said that, transferred. Often this, when they provided this different potency, spirit or wind to a specific person, it was transferred through a traumatic event when the person encountered the spirit being. And when he got the spirit or potency or wind, they would first turn mad and would need to be treated by a healer shaman to become a healer or shaman himself or herself. Spirit beings could also take the form of prey animals. Therefore, if a hunted animal behaved in an unfamiliar or unspecies-like way, it might be a spirit being and it should be avoided instead of being further processed and consumed. Spirit beings had a wide array of, let's say, powers or capacities. They could heal diseases, treat bad luck in hunting, or bring rain. There were also moral guardians supervising the following of taboo rules and ecological sustainabilities by preventing overexploitation. For example, if someone hunted too much, i.e. unsustainably, he could become sick and would need to be treated by a healer shaman. Spirit beings could also be asked for rain. There was one story that a spirit being had been asked for bags of rain, but instead provided bags of mosquitoes, not exactly what had been asked for. This again illustrates the ambivalence of spirit beings. So the shamans, healers could communicate and negotiate with the spirit being during the healing trance dance. These shamans or healers were, for instance, the ones realizing the cause of a disease, which could be, among other things, too much hunting, disrespectful behavior, or in general, the disobedience of taboo rules. Therefore, in a nutshell, I think spirit beings and the healer shamans who could communicate with them played a pivotal role in what we might call resource management. These few examples, I hope, have illustrated that Haiːom maintained a variety of relations to other humans, to land, to animals, and spirit beings. It was important to maintain these mutual relations. In their onto-epistemology, there was no nature-culture divide, no natural-supernatural divide, and not an anthropocentric perception of humans in their environment, or humans above the environment. Haiːom perceived themselves as part of a relational world, including human and beyond the human beings, as an integral part of a meshwork, in Ingold's terms. They share many characteristics with other indigenous groups around the world. Similar social relations and practices have been observed by other anthropologists and ethnohistorians. For example, the development and use of exclusive family hunting territories, seasonally specific variations in hunting, sharing practices, food taboos, ritually prescribed behavior towards animals, prohibitions against overhunting and meat wastage, and so on, were described by others as well. While these practices may not be part of a conscious attempt to live sustainably, they nevertheless have served sustainability. Yet I do not want to evoke the image of the so-called ecological noble savage, discussed extensively in anthropology and beyond since the 90s. For example, Haiːom also told me about the way to hunt ostriches at times. They would put a poisoned arrow in the nest, killing father and mother when sitting on the eggs, a way which could not be called sustainable. They also stressed when relating this that it was an ugly way to kill, implying that there was a feeling that it was not quite right to do it. Furthermore, their ways of knowing and relating to the world is changing in the historical and political context, implying not only that they were disposed of their land, the historical context, but that they were also deprived of their relationships to beyond the human beings. Furthermore, nowadays, other hegemonic onto-epistemologies are at work, not only, but also in the context of nature conservation. Haiďom are nowadays mostly living in townships or resettlement farms. Only a few are still employed in the national park, but without access to their former settlements. Therefore, many aspects of this relating to the world, to other human and beyond the human others, are crumbling away. But still, I think there's something to learn from them. More than the specific practices which might serve sustainability, it is their way to relate to the world, their onto-epistemology, their way of knowing in being. This does not only refer to Haiďom, but to many non-Western or indigenous people around the world. I use another quote to exemplify the different ways to apprehend the world seen by an anthropologist and to act in the world, this time by Nurul David, who worked with Nayaka, a hunter-gatherer group in South India. She explained, if cutting trees into parts epitomizes the modernist epistemology, talking with trees, I argue, epitomizes Nayaka animistic epistemology. Talking is shorthand for a two-way responsive relatedness with a tree. To talk with a tree rather than cut it down is to perceive what it does as one acts towards it, being aware concurrently of changes in oneself and the tree. It is expecting a response and responding, growing into mutual responsiveness and furthermore, possibly into mutual responsibility. If the object of the modernist epistemology is a totalizing scheme of separated essences, approached ideally from a separated viewpoint, the object of this animistic knowledge is understanding relatedness from a related point of view within the shifting horizons of the related viewer. Knowledge in the first case, so in the Western way, is having, acquiring, applying, and improving representations of things in the world. Knowledge in the second case is developing the skills of being in the world with other things. Knowing in the second case grows from and is maintaining relatedness with neighboring others. Okay, I like this quote, even if it in a way might be too antagonistic and dualist in juxtaposing the Western way of knowledge or the Western idea of knowledge and the Nayaka way of knowledge, but I do think there's something to think about or to think with in this understanding. Taking relations seriously, alternative visions for conservation or beyond. I think for me, what is most important in working with the Haiďom was this idea of being part of the ecology. There's no separation of humans from nature. They were just this is how I experienced it. While they were still living in Etosha, they were still part of the whole ecology. It was an integrated ecology and not an ecology where the person takes himself out. It was less anthropocentric, or rather anthro-Eurocentric perspective. It provides a less anthropocentric perspective. It could also be taking relations serious might also mean to relearn mutual respect and relating to by reanimating nature. It would also, because you have the point of view from within and not as we think from above, it would mean that you take local knowledge and more serious in the acknowledgement of people's entanglements. For example, their connection to land and other human entities. It would also include the integration or mean the integration and the taking serious, acknowledge and integrate local knowledge in conservation and management of protected areas. And national parks. It could also imply, in the best, it would mean that relational onto epistemologies, their ways of knowing and being, would be taken as equal partners in reparation processes, conservation initiatives, and development. It would not mean that now Haiďom are put on resettlement farms, they're supposed to become farmers there. The area is anyway not big enough for enough people to farm there, but this way it is not acknowledging their way of knowing and being and their way of relating to the world. And maybe now it's too late already because they were evicted in the 1950s. It would also mean to refrain from imposing concepts of development or values entrenched in dominant ontologies onto the very people whose losses or even damages are intended to be alleviated. And thinking further, it could also include a consideration of more other than human legal persons in jurisdiction, something which is happening at other continents already. Like, there's a river in New Zealand who has the status as a legal person, and the Mother Earth is acknowledged in the Constitution in Ecuador. The point I would like to stress is that we can learn from them a different way to relate to others, humans and non-humans, not to relate to nature and parts of it as objects, but to treat them with respect and, so to speak, on an equal basis. Thereby, I do not suggest that we all need to experience spirit beings the same way that Haiďom do, which is anyway impossible. Rather, that we need another way to relate to our surroundings. Maybe then, who knows, we would also experience spirit beings. But that's not my point. With Ingold, I agree that we relate to the world and we know from the world from within and not from above. In the current ecological crisis, we become increasingly aware that humans are very much dependent on what Westerners call nature, and we painfully make the experience that we are not on top of it and can't control all of it. Thus, I return to the start of my presentation and ask, can we imagine a world full of relatives, not of resources? Can we imagine wealth as the number of good relationships we maintain? Skip the next one and I'm done. Thank you.